The Outline of History, being a plain history of life and mankind by H.G. Wells, revised and brought up to the end of the Second World War by Raymond Postgate, with maps and plans by J.F. Horton, Volume 1, Book 4, Chapter 21, Greek Thought, Literature, and Art. Section 1, The Athens of Pericles. Section 2, Socrates. Section 3, Plato and the Academy. Section 4, Aristotle and the Lyceum. Section 5, Philosophy becomes unworldly. Section 6, The Quality and Limitations of Greek Thought. Section 7, The First Great Imaginative Literature. Section 8, Greek Art. Section 1, Greek History for the next 40 years after Plataea and Mycale is a story of comparative peace and tranquility. There were wars, but there were not intense wars. For a little while in Athens, for a section of the prosperous, there was leisure and opportunity, and by a combination of accidents and through the character of a small group of people, this leisure and opportunity produced the most memorable results. The achievement of a method of writing that could render the sounds and subtleties of spoken language had now made literature possible, and much beautiful literature was produced. Plastic arts flourished, and the foundations of modern science, already laid by the earlier philosophers in the Ionian Greek cities, were consolidated. Then, after an interlude of 50-odd years, the long smoldering hostility between Athens and Sparta broke out into a fierce and exhausting war, which sapped at last the vitality of this creative movement. This war is known in history as the Peloponnesian War. It went on for nearly 30 years and wasted all the power of Greece. At first Athens was in the ascendant, then Sparta. Then arose Thebes, a city not 50 miles from Athens, to overshadow Sparta. Once more Athens flared into importance as the head of a confederation. It is a story of narrow rivalries and inexplicable hatreds that would have vanished long ago out of the memories of men, were it not that it is recorded and reflected in a great literature. As much as it's better for people to actually learn things, the fact that things get written down means that some stuff survived that otherwise wouldn't have. Through all this time, Persia appears and reappears as the ally, first of this league and then of that. About the middle of the 4th century BCE, Greece becomes aware of a new influence in its affairs, that of Philip, king of Macedonia. Macedonia does indeed arise in the background of this incurably divided Greece, as the Medes and Persians arose behind the Chaldean Empire. Remember, they were called Chaldean with a twist on the word Kushti, which was the sacred thread, and they performed a ritual with that. The time comes when the Greek mind turns round, so to speak, from its disputes, and stares in one united dismay at the Macedonian. Planless and murderous squabbles are still planless and murderous squabbles, even though Thucydides tells the story, even though the great beginnings of a new civilization are wrecked by their disorders, and in this general outline we can give no space at all to the particulars of these internecine feuds, to the fights and flights that sent first this Greek city, and then that up to the sky in flames. Upon a 1-foot globe, Greece becomes a speck almost too small to recognize. And in a short history of mankind, all this century and more of dissension between the days of Salamis and Plataea and the rise of King Philip shrinks to a little, almost inaudible clash of disputation, to a mere note upon the swift passing of opportunity for nations as for men. But what does not shrink into significance because it has entered into the intellectual process of all subsequent nations, because it is inseparably a part of our mental foundation, is the literature that Greece produced during such patches and gleams of tranquility and security as these times afforded her. Says Professor Gilbert Murray, their outer political history, indeed, like that of all other nations, is filled with war and diplomacy, with cruelty and deceit. It is the inner history, the history of thought and feeling and character, that is so grand. They had some difficulties to contend with, which are now almost out of our path. They had practically no experience, but were doing everything for the first time. They were utterly weak in material resources, and their emotions, their desires and fears and rages were probably wilder and fiercer than ours. Yet they produced the Athens of Pericles and Plato, this remarkable culmination of the long-gathering creative power of the Greek mind, which for 23 centuries has been the men of intelligence, a guiding and inspiring beacon has been to men of intelligence, the guiding inspiring beacon out of the past, flared up after the battles of Marathon and Salamis, had made Athens free and fearless, and without any great excesses of power predominant in her world. It was the work of a quite small group of men. A number of her citizens lived for the better part of a generation under conditions which, in all ages, have disposed men to produce good and beautiful work. They were secure, they were free, and they had pride, and they were without that temptation of apparent and unchallenged power which disposes all of us to inflict wrongs upon our fellow men. When political life narrowed down again to the waste and crimes of a fratricidal war with Sparta, there was so broad and well-fed a flame of intellectual activity burning that it lasted through all the windy distresses of this war and beyond the brief lifetime of Alexander the Great, for a period altogether of more than 100 years after the wars began. Flushed with victory, in the sense of freedom fairly won, the people of Athens did, for a time, rise towards nobility. Under the guidance of a great demagogue, Pericles, the chief official of the Athenian General Assembly, and a politician, statesman, rather of the caliber of Gladstone or Lincoln in modern history, they were set to the task of rebuilding their city and expanding their commerce. For a time they were capable of following a generous leader generously, and fate gave them a generous leader. In Pericles there was mingled in the strangest fashion political ability with a real living passion for deep and high and beautiful things. He kept in power for over 30 years. He was a man of extraordinary vigor and liberality of mind. He stamped these qualities upon his time. As Winkler has remarked, the Athenian democracy had for a time the face of Pericles. He was sustained by what was probably a very great and noble friendship. There was a woman of unusual education, Aspasia from Miletus, whom he could not marry because of the law that restricted the citizenship of Athens to the home-born, but who was in effect his wife. She played a large part in gathering about him men of unusual gifts. All the great writers of the time knew her, and several have praised her wisdom. Plutarch, it is true, accuses her of instigating a troublesome and dangerous, but finally successful war against Samos. But as he himself shows later, this was necessitated by the naval hostility of the Samians, which threatened the overseas trade of Athens, upon which all the prosperity of the republic depended. Men's ambitions were apt to reflect the standards of their intimates. Pericles was content, at any rate, to serve as a leader in Athens, rather than to dominate as a tyrant. Alliances were formed under his guidance. New colonies and trading stations were established from Italy to the Black Sea, and the treasures of the League at Delos were brought to Athens, convinced of his security from Persia. Pericles spent the war hoard of the allies upon the beautification of his city. This was an unrighteous thing to do by our modern standards. Well, isn't it done all the time? Misusing of public funds? Well, that doesn't make it any right. But it was not a base or greedy thing to do. Athens had accomplished the work of the Delian League, and is not the laborer worthy of his hire. This sequestrian made a time of exceptional opportunity for architects and artists. The Parthenon of Athens, whose ruins are still a thing of beauty, was but the crown set upon the clustering glories of the Athens Pericles rebuilt. Such sculptures as those of Phidias, Meron, and Polykleitos that still survive witness to the artistic quality of the time. The reader must bear in mind that illuminating remark of Winkler's, which says that this Renaissance Athens bore for a time the face of Pericles. It was the peculiar genius of this man and of his atmosphere that let loose the genius of men about him, and attracted men of great intellectual vigor to Athens. Athens wore his face for a time as one wears a mask, and then became restless and desired to put him aside. There was very little that was great and generous about the common Athenian. We have told of the spirit of one sample voter for the ostracism of Aristides, and Lloyd, as age Pericles, declares that the Athenians would not suffer the name of Miltiades, declares that the Athenians would not suffer the name of Miltiades to be mentioned in connection with the Battle of Marathon. I've actually read the same line twice a couple of times here. The sturdy self-respect of the common voters revolted presently against the beautiful buildings rising about them, against the favors shown to such sculptures as Phidias over popular worthies in the same line of business, against the donations made to a mere foreigner like Herodotus of Halicarnassus, against the insulting preference of Pericles for the company and conversation of a Milesian woman. The public life of Pericles was conspicuously orderly, and that presently set the man in the street thinking that his private life must be very corrupt. One gathers that Pericles was superior in his demeanor. He betrayed at times a contempt for the citizens he served. Pericles acquired not only an elevation of sentiment and a loftiness and purity of style far removed from the low expression of the vulgar, but likewise a gravity of countenance which relaxed not into laughter, a firm and even tone of voice, an easy deportment, and a decency of dress which no vehemence of speaking ever put into disorder. These things, and others of the like nature, excited admiration in all that saw him. Such was his conduct when a vile and abandoned fellow loaded him with whole day with reproaches and abuse. He bore it with patience and silence, and continued in public for the dispatch of some urgent affairs. In the evening he walked softly home, this impudent wretch following and insulting him all the way with the most scurrilous language. And as it was dark, when he came to his own door, he ordered one of his servants to take a torch and light the man home. The poet Jan Haber says that he was proud and supercilious in conversation, and that there was a great deal of vanity and contempt of others mixed with his dignity of manner. He appeared not in the streets except when he went to the Forum, or the Senate House. He declined the invitations of his friends and all social entertainments and recreations, insomuch that in the whole time of his administration, which was a considerable length, he never went to sup with any of his friends but once, which was at the marriage of his nephew Eurypylus, and he stayed there only until the ceremony of libation was ended. He considered that the freedom of entertainments takes away all distinction of office, and that dignity is but little consistent with familiarity. There was as yet no gutter journalism, to tell the world of the vileness of the conspicuous and successful, but the common man, a little out of conceit with himself, found much consolation in the art of comedy, which flourished exceedingly. The writers of comedy satisfied that almost universal craving for the depreciation of those whose apparent excellence offends our self-love. They threw dirt steadily and industriously at Pericles and his friends. Pericles was portrayed in a helmet became him, and it is to be feared he knew as much. This led to much joy and mirth over the pleasant suggestion of a frightfully distorted head, an onion head. The goings-on of Aspasia were, of course, a fruitful vineyard for the inventions of the street. Dreaming souls, weary of the vulgarities of our time, have desired to be transferred to the sublime age of Pericles, but plumped down into that Athens, they would have found themselves in very much the atmosphere of the lower sort of contemporary music hall, very much in the vein of our popular newspapers, the same hot blast of braying libel, foul imputation, greedy patriotism, and general baseness would have blown upon them. The modern note would have pursued them. As the memories of Plataea and Salamis faded, and the new buildings grew familiar, Pericles and the pride of Athens became more and more offensive to the homely humor of the crowd. He was never ostracized. His prestige with the quieter citizens saved him from that, but he was attacked, and increasing boldness and steadfastness. Athene of the Parthenon, he lived and died a poor man. He was perhaps the most honest of demagogues, but this did not save him from an abortive prosecution for peculation. Defeated in that, his enemies resorted to a more devious method. They began to lop away his friends. Religious intolerance and moral accusations are the natural weapons of the envious against the leaders of men. His friend, Damon, was ostracized. Phidias was attacked for impiety. On the shield of the great statue of the goddess Athene, Phidias had dared to put among the combatants in a fight between Greeks and Amazons portraits of Pericles and himself. Phidias died in prison, and Anaxagoras, a stranger welcomed to Athens by Pericles, when there were plenty of honest fellows already there quite willing to satisfy any reasonable curiosities, was saying the strangest things about the sun and stars, and hinting not obscurely that there were no gods, but only one animating spirit, Nous, in the world. The comedy writers suddenly found they had deep religious feelings that could be profoundly and even dangerously shocked, and Anaxagoras fled the threat of a prosecution. Then came the turn of Aspasia. Athens seemed bent on deporting her, and Pericles was torn between the woman who was the soul of his life and the ungracious city he had saved, defended, and made more beautiful and unforgettable than any other city in history. He stood up to defend Aspasia. He was seized by a storm of very human emotion, and as he spoke he wept. His tears saved Aspasia for a time. The Athenians were content to humiliate Pericles, but he had served them so long that they were indisposed to do without him. He had been their leader now for a third of a century. In 431 BCE came the war with Sparta. Plutarch accuses Pericles of bringing it on because he felt his popularity waned so fast that a war was needed to make him indispensable. And as he himself was becoming obnoxious to the people upon Phidias's account, and was afraid of being called and questioned for it, he urged on the war, which as yet was uncertain, and blew up that flame which till then was stifled and suppressed. By this means he hoped to obviate the accusations that threatened him, and to mitigate the rage of envy, because such was his dignity and power that in all important affairs and in every great danger the Republic could place its confidence in him alone. But the war was a slow and dangerous war, and the Athenian people were impatient. A certain Cleon arose, ambitious to oust Pericles from his leadership. There was a great clamor for a swift ending of a war. Cleon set out to be the man who won the war. The popular poets got to work in this fashion. Thou king of satires, words left out, why boast thy prowess, yet shudder at the sound of sharpened swords, spite of the flaming Cleon. An expedition under the leadership of Pericles was unsuccessful, and Cleon seized the opportunity for a prosecution. Pericles was suspended from his command and fined. The story goes that his eldest son, this was not the son of Aspasia, but of a former wife, turned against him and pursued him with vile and incredible accusations. This young man was carried off by the plague. Then the sister of Pericles died, and then his last legitimate son, when after the fashion of the time he put the funeral garlands on the boy, he wept aloud. Presently he himself took the contagion and died. 429 BCE. The salient facts of this brief summary will serve to show how discordant Pericles was with much of the life of his city. This intellectual and artistic outbreak in Athens was no doubt favored by the conditions of the time, but it was also due in part to the appearance of some very unusual men. It was not a general movement. It was the movement of a small group of people exceptionally placed and gifted. Section 2. Another leading figure in this Athenian movement, a figure still more out of harmony with the life around him, and quite as much an original source and stimulant of the enduring greatness of his age, was a man called Socrates, the son of a stonemason. He was born about 16 years later than Herodotus, and he was beginning to be heard of about the time when Pericles died. He himself wrote nothing, but it was his custom to talk in public places. There was in those days a great searching for wisdom going on. There was a various multitude of teachers called sophists who reasoned upon truth, beauty, and right living, and instructed the developing curiosities and imaginations of youth. This was so because there were no great priestly schools in Greece, and into these discussions this man came, a clumsy and slovenly figure, barefooted, gathering about him a band of admirers and disciples. His method was profoundly skeptical. He believed that the only possible virtue was true knowledge. He would tolerate no belief, no hope that he could not pass the ultimate acid test. For himself, this means virtue, but for many of his weaker followers, it meant the loss of beliefs and moral habits that would have restrained their impulses. These weaklings became self-excusing, self-indulging scoundrels. Among his young associates were Plato, who afterwards immortalized his method in a series of philosophical dialogues, and founded the philosophical school of the Academy, which lasted 900 years. Xenophon, of the 10,000, who described his death, and Isocrates, one of the wisest of Greek political thinkers. But there were also Critias, who, when Athens was utterly defeated by Sparta, was leader among the 30 tyrants appointed by the Spartans to keep the crushed city under and destroyed its educational organization. Charmides, who was killed beside Critias when the 30 were overthrown, and Alcibiades, a brilliant and complex traitor, who did much to lead Athens into the disastrous expedition against Syracuse, which destroyed her strength, who betrayed her to the Spartans, and who was at last assassinated while on his way to the Persian court to contrive mischief against Greece. These latter pupils were not the only young men of promise whose vulgar faith and patriotism Socrates destroyed, to leave nothing in its place. His most inveterate enemy was a certain Notus, whose son, a devoted disciple of Socrates, had become a hopeless drunkard. Through Notus, it was Socrates was at last prosecuted for corrupting the youth of Athens and condemned to death by drinking a poisonous draught made from hemlock, 399 BCE. His death is described with great beauty in the Dialogue of Plato, called by the name Phaedo. Section 3. Plato was born 427 BCE, and he lived for 80 years. In mental temperament, Plato was of an altogether different type from Socrates. He was a most artistic and delicate writer, and Socrates could write nothing consecutive. He cared for beautiful things, and Socrates despised them. He was supremely concerned with the ordering of public affairs and the scheming of happier human relationships, while Socrates, heedless of heat and cold and the opinion of his fellow creatures, concentrated his mind upon a serene disillusionment. Life, said Socrates, was deception. Only the soul lived. Plato had a very great affection for this rugged old teacher. He found his method of the utmost value in disentangling and clearing up opinions, and he made him the central figure of his immortal dialogues, but his own thoughts and disposition turned him altogether away from the skeptical attitude. In many of the dialogues, the voice is the voice of Socrates, but the thought is the thought of Plato. Plato was living in a time of doubt and questioning about all human relationships. In the great days of Pericles, before 450 BCE, there seems to have been a complete satisfaction in Athens with social and political institutions. Then there seemed no reason for questioning. Men felt free, the community prospered. One suffered chiefly from jealousy. The history of Herodotus displays little or no dissatisfaction with Athenian political institutions, but Plato, who was born about the time Herodotus died, and who grew up in the atmosphere of a disastrous war and great social distress and confusion, was from the first face to face with human discord and the misfit of human institutions. To that challenge his mind responded. One of his earlier works and his latest are bold, penetrating discussions of the possible betterment of social relations. Socrates had taught him to take nothing for granted, not even the common relations of husband and wife or parent and child. His Republic, the first of all utopian books, is a young man's dream of a city in which human life is arranged according to a novel and a better plan. His last, unfinished work, The Laws, is a discussion of the regulation of another such utopia. There's much in Plato at which we cannot even glance here, but it is a landmark in this history. It is a new thing in the development of mankind, this appearance of the idea of willfully and completely casting human conditions. So far, mankind has been living by traditions under the fear of the gods. Here is a man who says boldly to our race, and as if it were a quite reasonable and natural thing to say, take hold of your lives. Most of these things that distress you, you can avoid. Most of these things that dominate you, you can overthrow. You can do as you will with them. One other thing besides the conflicts of the time perhaps stimulated the mind of Plato in this direction. In the days of Pericles, Athens had founded many settlements overseas, and the setting up of these settlements had familiarized men with the idea that a community need not grow, it could also be made. Closely associated with Plato was a younger man who later also maintained a school in Athens and lived to an even greater age. This was Isocrates. He was what we should call a publicist, a writer rather than an orator, and his peculiar work was to develop the idea of Herodotus, the idea of a unification of Greece against the Persian Empire as a remedy for the baseness and confusion of her politics and the waste and destruction of her internecine wars. His political horizon was in some respects broader than Plato's, and in his latter years he looked towards monarchy, and particularly towards the Macedonian monarchy of Philip, as a more unifying and broadening method of government than city democracy. The same drift to monarchist ideas had occurred in the case of that Xenophon whose Anabasis we have already mentioned. In his old age, Xenophon wrote the Catapoedia, a vindication, both theoretically and practically, of absolute monarchy as shown in the organization of the Persian Empire. Section 4. Plato taught in the academy. To him, in his old age, came a certain good-looking youngster from Stagiré, in Macedonia. Aristotle, who was the son of the Macedonian king's physician and a man with a very different type of mind from that of the great Athenian. He was naturally so capable of the imaginative will and with a great respect for and comprehension of established fact. Later on, after Plato was dead, he set up a school at the Lyceum, Athens, and taught, criticizing Plato and Socrates with a certain hardness. When he taught, the shadow of Alexander the Great lay across the freedom of Greece, and he favored slavery and constitutional kings. He had previously been the tutor of Alexander for several years at the court of Philip of Macedon, and to a huge extent, it's not about what type of government, but the principles of those who are supportive of the government and those who are, the officials of the government. Intelligent men were losing heart in those days. Their faith in the power of men to make their own conditions of life was fading. There were no more utopias. The rush of events was manifestly too powerful for such organized effort as was then practicable between men of fine intelligence. It was possible to think of recasting human society when human society was a little city of a few thousand citizens. But what was happening about them was something cataclysmal. It was the political recasting of the whole known world, of the affairs of what even then must have amounted to something between 50 and 100 million people. It was recasting upon a scale no human mind was yet equipped to grasp. It drove thought back upon the idea of a vast and implacable fate. It made men snatch at whatever looked stable and unifying. Monarchy, for instance, for all its manifest vices, was a conceivable government for millions. It had, to a certain extent, worked. It imposed a ruling will where it would seem that a collective will was impossible. This change of the general intellectual mood harmonized with Aristotle's natural respect for existing fact. If on one hand it made him approve of monarchy and slavery and the subjection of women as reasonable institutions, on the other hand it made him eager to understand fact and get some orderly knowledge of these realities of nature and human nature that were now so manifestly triumphant over the creative dreams of the preceding generation. Now, it's feminism that subjects women. Well, it objectifies women. It's like, okay, objectifying the women versus subjectifying. It's like, is it really better? He is terribly sane and luminous, and terribly wanting in self-sacrificial enthusiasm. He questions Plato when Plato would exile poets from his utopia. For poetry is a power. He directs his energy along a line diametrically opposed to Socrates' depreciation of Anaxagoras. He anticipated Bacon and the modern scientific movement. In his realization of the importance of ordered knowledge, he set himself to the task of gathering together and setting down knowledge. He was first natural historian. Other men before him had speculated about the nature of things, but he, with every young man he could win over to the task, set himself to classify and compare things. Plato says, in effect, let us take hold of life and remodel it. This soberer succession. Let us first know more of life and meanwhile serve and use the king. It was not so much a contradiction as an immense qualification of the master. The peculiar relation of Aristotle to Alexander the Great enabled him to procure means for his work, such as were not available again for scientific inquiry for long ages. He could command hundreds of talents. A talent is about 240 euros, or is that pounds? Or what's that L second line through the thing mean? A euro? For his expenses? At one time, he had at his disposal 1,000 men scattered throughout Asia and Greece, collecting matter for his natural history. They were, of course, very untrained observers, collectors of stories rather than observers, but nothing of the kind had ever been attempted and had even been thought of. So far as we know, before his time, political as well as natural science began. The students of the Acume, under his direction, made an analysis of 158 political constitutions. This was the first gleam of organized scientific inquiry in the world, the early death of Alexander, and the breaking up of his empire almost before it had begun. Put an end to endowments on this scale for 2,000 years. Only in Egypt, at the Alexandria Museum, did any scientific research continue, and that only for a few generations. Of that, we will presently tell. 50 years after Aristotle's death, the Acume had already dwindled to insignificance. Section 5. The general drift of thought in the concluding years of 4th century BCE was not with Aristotle, nor toward the laborious and necessary accumulation of ordered knowledge. It is possible that without his endowments from the king, he would have made but a small figure in intellectual history. Through them, he was able to give his splendid intelligence substance and effect. The ordinary man prefers easy ways so long as they may be followed, and is almost willfully heedless whether they end at last in a cul-de-sac. Finding the stream of events too powerful to control at once, the generality of philosophical teachers drifted in those days from the scheming of model cities and the planning of new ways of living into the elaboration of beautiful and consoling systems of evasion. Perhaps that is putting things coarsely and unjustly, but let Professor Gilbert Murray speak upon this matter. The Cynics cared only for virtue and the relation of the soul to God. The world and its learning and its honors were as dross to them. The Stoics and Epicureans, so far apart at first sight, were very similar in their ultimate aim. What they really cared about was ethics, the practical question how a man should order his life. Both, indeed, gave themselves to some science, the Epicureans to physics, the Stoics to logic and rhetoric, but only as a means to an end. The Stoic tried to win men's hearts and convictions by sheer subtlety of abstract argument and dazzling sublimity of thought and expression. The Epicurean was determined to make humanity go its way without cringing to capricious gods and without sacrificing free will. He condensed his gospel into 4 maxims. God is not to be feared, death cannot be felt, the good can be won, all that we dread can be borne and conquered. And meanwhile, the stream of events flowed on with a reciprocal indifference to philosophy. Section 6. If the Greek classics are to be read with any benefit by modern men, they must be read as the work of men like ourselves. Regard must be had to their traditions, their opportunities, and their limitations. There is a disposition to exaggeration in all human administration. Most of our classical texts are very much mangled, and all were originally the work of human beings in difficulties, living in a time of such darkness and narrowness of outlook as makes our own age, by comparison, a period of dazzling illumination. What we shall lose in reverence by this familiar treatment, we shall gain in sympathy for that group of troubled, uncertain, and very modern minds. The Athenian writers were, indeed, the first of modern men. They were discussing questions that we still discuss. They began to struggle with the great problems that confront us today. Their writings are our dream. Jung, in his Psychology of the Unconscious, is very good on the differences between ancient, pre-Athenian thought and modern thought. The former he calls undirected thinking, the latter directed thinking. The former was a thinking in images akin to dreaming, the latter a thinking in words. Science is an organization of direct thinking. The antique spirit before the Greek thinkers created not science but mythology. The ancient human world was a world of subjective fantasies like the world of children and uneducated young people today, and like the world of savages and dreams. Infantile thought and dreams are a re-echo of prehistoric and savage methods of thinking. Myths, says Jung, are the mass dreams of people, and dreams the myths of individuals. We have already directed the reader's attention to the resemblance of the early gods of civilization to the fantasies of children, the work of hard and disciplined thinking by means of carefully analyzed words and statements, which was begun by the Greek thinkers and resumed by the scholastic philosophers in the Middle Ages, was a necessary preliminary to the development of modern science, the Greek philosophers began an inquiry and they arrived at no solutions. We cannot pretend today that we have arrived at solutions to most of the questions they asked. The mind of the Hebrews, as we have already shown, awoke suddenly to the endless miseries and disorders of life, saw that these miseries and disorders were largely due to the lawless acts of men, and concluded that salvation could come only through subduing ourselves to the service of the one God who rules heaven and earth. The Greek, rising to the same perception, was not prepared with the same idea of a patriarchal deity. He lived in a world in which there was not God, but the gods. Yet perhaps he felt the gods themselves were limited. While the Hebrews encountered polytheism too, and the most common understanding the Hebrew thought was through Christianity, so then he thought of fate behind them, cold and impersonal. So he put his problem in the form of an inquiry as to what was right living, without any definite correlation of the right living man with the will of God. To us, looking at the matter from a standpoint purely historical, the common problem can now be presented in a form that, for the purpose of history, covers both the Hebrew and Greek way of putting it. We have seen our kind rising out of the unconsciousness of animals to a continuing racial self-consciousness, realizing the unhappiness of its wild diversity of aims, realizing the inevitable tragedy of individual self-seeking, and feeling its way blindly towards some linking and subordinating idea to save it from the pains and accidents of mere individuality. The gods, the god king, the idea of the tribe, the idea of the city, here are ideas that have claimed and held for a time the devotion of men, ideas in which they have a little lost their individual selfishness and escaped the realization of a more enduring life. Yet, as our wars and disasters prove, none of these greater ideas has yet been great enough. The gods have failed to protect, the tribe has proved itself vile and cruel, the city ostracized one's best and truest friends, the god king made a beast of himself. As we read over the speculative literature of this great period of the Greeks, we realize three barriers set about the Greek mind from which it rarely escaped, but from which we now perhaps are beginning to escape. The first of these limitations was the obsession of the Greek mind by the idea of the city as the ultimate state, in a world in which empire had followed empire, each greater than its predecessor, in a world through which men and ideas drove ever more loosely and freely, in a world visibly unifying. Even then, the Greeks, because of their peculiar physical and political circumstances, were still dreaming, and possibly, of a compact little city-state, impervious to outer influences, valiantly secure against the whole world. Plato's estimate of the number of citizens in a perfect state varied between 1,000 in the Republic and 5,040 in the Laws, said Aristotle in his Politics. For the proper administration of justice and for the distribution of authority, it is necessary that the citizens be acquainted with each other's characters, so that, where this cannot be, much mischief ensues, both in the use of authority and in the administration of justice, for it is not just to decide arbitrarily, as must be the case with excessive population. The sort of parish state thus sketched out was to go to war and hold its own against other cities of the same size, and this was not a couple of generations after the hosts of Xerxes had crossed the Hellespont. Perhaps these Greeks thought the day of world empires had passed forever, whereas it was only beginning. At the utmost, their minds reached out to alliances and leagues. There must have been men at the court of Artaxerxes thinking far away beyond these little ideas of the rocky creek, the island, and the mountain encircled valley. But the need for unification against the greater powers that moved outside the Greek-speaking world, the Greek mind disregarded willfully. These outsiders were barbarians, not to be needlessly thought about. They were barred out now from Greece forever. One took Persian money, everybody took Persian money. What did it matter? Or one enlisted for a time in their armies as Xenophon did, and hoped for his luck with a rich prisoner. Athens took sides in Egyptian affairs and carried on minor wars with Persia, but there was no conception of a common policy or a common future for Greece, until at last a voice in Athens began to shout, Macedonia, the clamor like a watchdog. Macedonia. This was the voice of the orator and demagogue, Demosthenes, hurling warnings and threats and denunciations at King Philip of Macedon, who had learnt his politics not only from Plato and Aristotle, but also from Isocrates and Xenophon, and from Babylon and Susa, and who was preparing quietly, ably, and steadfastly to dominate all Greece, and through Greece to conquer the known world. There was a second thing that cramped the Greek mind, the institution of domestic slavery. Slavery was implicit in Greek life. Men could conceive of neither comfort nor dignity without it, but slavery shuts off one's sympathy, not only from the class of one's fellow subjects, well, particularly if there's enough ethics to essentially make the slave and slave master equal, or at least, give their rights to them, right? It puts the slave owner into a class and organization against all stranger men. One is an electrine, Plato, carried by his clear reason, and the noble sanity of the spirit beyond the things of the present would have abolished slavery. Much popular feeling and the new comedy were against it. The Stoics and Epicureans, many of whom were slaves, condemned it as unnatural, finding it too strong to upset, decided that it did not affect the soul and might be ignored. With the wise, there was no bound or free, to the matter-of-fact Aristotle, and probably to most practical men its abolition was inconceivable, so they declared that there were in the world men naturally slaves. Finally, the thought of the Greeks was hampered by a want of knowledge that is almost inconceivable to us today. They had no knowledge of the past of mankind at all. At best, they had a few shrewd guesses. They had no knowledge of geography beyond the range of the Mediterranean basin and the frontiers of Persia. We know far more today of what was going on in Susa, Persepolis, Babylon, and Memphis in the time of Pericles than he did. Their astronomical ideas were still in the state of rudimentary speculations. Anaxagoras, greatly daring, thought the sun and the moon were vast globes, so vast that the sun was probably as big as all the Peloponnesus. Their ideas in physics and chemistry were the results of profound cogitation. It is wonderful that they did guess at atomic structure. One has to remember their extraordinary poverty in the matter of experimental apparatus. They had colored glass for ornament, but no clear glass, no accurate means of measuring the minor intervals of time, no really efficient numerical notation, no very accurate scales, no rudiments of telescope or microscope. A modern scientific man dumped down in the Athens of Pericles would have found the utmost difficulty in demonstrating the elements of his knowledge. However crudely to the man, he would have found there. He would have had to rig up the simplest apparatus under every disadvantage, while Socrates pointed out the absurdity of seeking truth with pieces of wood and string and metal such as small boys use for fishing. A snobbish aloofness between the philosopher and the artisan kept the former away from any apparatus. No Greek gentleman would have tinkered with glass or metals, and our professor of science would also have been in constant danger of a prosecution for impiety. The democracy of Athens would have tolerated Darwin as little as the democracy of Tennessee. Well, America's never had democracy. Our world today draws upon relatively immense accumulations of knowledge of fact. In the age of Pericles, scarcely the first stone of our comparatively tremendous cairn of things recorded and proved had been put in place. When we reflect upon this difference, then it ceases to be remarkable that the Greeks, with all their aptitude for political speculation, were blind to the insecurities of their civilization, from without and from within, to the necessity for effective unification, to the swift rush of events that was to end for long ages these brief freedoms of the human mind. It is not in the results it achieved, but in the attempts it made, that the true value for us of this group of Greek talkers and writers lies. It is not that they answered questions, but that they dared to ask them. Never before had man challenged his world, and the way of life to which he found his birth had brought him. I think I've brought up examples elsewhere that would make point that they had. Never had he said before that he could alter his conditions. Tradition and a seeming necessity had held him to life as he had found it, grown up about his tribe since time immemorial. Hitherto he had taken the world as children still take the homes and habits in which they had been reared. So, in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, we perceive most plainly in Judea and Athens, but by no means confined to those centers, the beginnings of a moral and intellectual process in mankind, an appeal to righteousness and an appeal to the truth from the passions and confusions and immediate appearances of existence. It is like the dawn of the sense of responsibility in a youth, who suddenly discovers that life is neither easy nor aimless. Mankind is growing up. The rest of history for 23 centuries is threaded with the spreading out and development and interaction and clearer and more effective statement of these main leading ideas. Slowly, more and more men apprehended the reality of human brotherhood, the needlessness of wars and cruelties and oppression, the possibilities of a common purpose for the whole of our kind in every generation thereafter. There is the evidence of men seeking for that better order to which they feel our world must come. Everywhere and wherever in any man the great constructive ideas have taken hold, the hot greeds, the jealousies, the suspicions, and impatience that are in the nature of every one of us war against the struggle towards greater and broader purposes. The last 23 centuries of history, 24, right, are like the efforts of some impulsive, hasty, immortal, think clearly and live rightly. Blunder follows blunder, promising beginnings end in grotesque disappointments. Streams of living water are poisoned by the cup that conveys them to the thirsty lips of mankind. But the hopes of men rise again at last after every disaster. The hope of men rises again at last every disaster. Section 7. We have already remarked in this outline that the development of literature had to wait upon the development of a method of writing sufficiently subtle to convey turns of expression and beauties of sound. Before that time, written literature could convey only meaning. The early Aryan peoples had, as we have told already, a memorized metrical literature before they had writing. They had minstrel songs, stories, and histories, and moral precepts preserved by a special social class, the bards. These traditional processions only became fixed when they were written. The two chief Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, appear to have been set down in writing about 700 BCE, and they are both in Ionian Greek. It is said that Pisistratus first had the Homeric poems collected. There were a number of different versions of these epics. The existing text was only established in the 2nd century BCE. There were other epics, continuations and amplifications of the Iliad and Odyssey, and separate adventure stories that now have almost completely perished. It was generally held by the Greeks that the Iliad and the Odyssey were the work of a single poet, Homer, who was born in 7 different cities and at various dates between 1100 and 800 BCE. Of one fact only is tradition certain, and that is that he was blind. These two epics were held in such love and veneration by the Greeks that it was not until the 2nd century BCE that anyone observed the fact, obvious even in a translation, that these two great works are as entirely different in spirit, tone, and quality as the sound of a trumpet from the sound of a flute. But as Homer could be born so widely and with such sustained perseverance, it adds but little to his marvelousness that he had 2 brains and 2 voices. These are matters for the classical scholar. It is the classical scholar alone who can appreciate these works at their full value. They are, he assures us, of a splendor, beauty, wisdom, and melody that no translation can convey. No translation does convey anything to justify the ecstasies of the learned about these primary masterpieces of European literature. Into the work of every translator creeps a certain tediousness, a certain puerility, even the indescribably delightful melodies of the Greek language, recited by its enthusiastic advocates to the uncultivated doubter, prove to be more than a little suggestive of the noises caused by indifferent plumbing in a defective hot water system. Nonetheless, these epics contain much beauty and interest. They are suffused with a delightful boyishness. There are flashes of the intensest feeling and the most vivid observation, and it is a pity that the ridiculous extravagances of scholastic admirers, whose, most of my philosophy is scholastic philosophy, who speak of them as supreme and unapproachable, and so forth, have brought upon them the awe-stricken neglect of the general reader. Side by side with the name of Homer stands that of Hesiod. Hesiod was more probably a real person. The date of his birth is known within 2 centuries, the 9th and 7th BCE. His epics, the Works and Days, and the Theogony preserve the one much of the life and labors of the Boeotian farmer, and the other the current traditions about the origins and relationships of the Greek gods. Epic poetry was in Greece the foundation of all other poetry. For several centuries no other was cultivated. This was the essential Aryan poetry. Then appeared certain other types. There was elegiac poetry, soft and tender, sung to the music of the Lydian flute, and lyric poetry sung to the 7-stringed lyre. On these forms it is impossible to enlarge here. It is idle also to give the names of poets without some indication of the nature and quality of their poems. The names of Pindar and Simonides can have meaning only for those who can give the necessary time to what still remains accessible to their work, but we may note here that one of the greatest of the early love poets of Greece was a woman, Sappho of Lesbos. The written drama as well as the written poetry began in the Grecian world. Drama arose as part of the periodic celebration of Dionysus, the wine god. Originally, the celebration was a song and chorus telling of the doings of the god. Then the leader, the Corypheus, would stand out and recite alone, and the chorus would respond. Aeschylus, born 525 BCE, introduced a second actor who stood out and answered the first. Finally, with Sophocles, born 495 BCE, came a third actor. The dialogue and acting were developed, and the chorus became subordinate to the dramatic action. Hitherto the drama had been performed upon wooden platforms. Now in the 6th century, theaters began to be built. That much an outline of history may record, and also that within a period of a century came the greatest days of the Greek drama. The names of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, born 480 BCE, are the culminating names of Greek tragedy, but here they can only be unmeaning names to the reader, who will not seek out their work, either in the original or in reputable translations, and who will not try to see performances of their plays. Concurrently with the development of tragedy, the graver side of the worship of Dionysus, a more derisive and entertaining form arose, comedy. When the first comedy was more flexible than tragedy, sometimes it burlesqued tragedy, but at times it became frankly sketches of manners and of entertaining aspects of life. Aristophanes in the 5th century BCE created a delightful mixture of fancy and political satire. Menander, 100 years later, was the outstanding master of the comedy of manners. Greek tragedy was a temporary and formal thing. It was evolved and worked out to its highest possibilities in little more than a century, but comedy is an essential need of human societies. There has been mocking, imitation, comedy, wherever 2 or 3 human beings gather together since human associations began. The stream of written comedy has never really ceased in the world since first dialogue could be written. Only as the art of reading spread through the community did the written tale begin to rival comedy in its popularity. There were collections of good stories and so forth in Greece, but the development of fiction as a great art awaited a wide reading public, and the rapid multiplication of books, unhappily, the greater number of both the tragedies and comedies of Greece had vanished from the world again. Prose literature appeared first as history and serious discussion of Herodotus, we have told already, and we have quoted from his work. That comes earlier in the book, but the reader will note that the father of history visited Athens in the time of Pericles, and when he wrote, Athenian tragedy was already past its climax. Thucydides, still later, told the story of the Peloponnesian War, Xenophon and his Anabasis. Also, we have noted another important portion of the Greek literature that still remains to us are the orations written down of various great speakers. Finally, there are to be noted the austere prose statements and arguments of the scientific literature as it was written by Aristotle, and its artistic dramatization, and the discussions of the dialogues of Plato. So briefly, we note here the forms of the first great literature in the world. It is all we can do in the space at our disposal. The reader of English who would go on to a fuller account will find it with a number of skillfully interwoven quotations in Greeks and Barbarians by J.A.K. Thompson, but the only way of achieving a real grasp of any literature whatever is the attentive reading of particular books and writers. Section 8. Before the discovery of pre-Greek art of the Aegean peoples and the realization of the vast artistic production of early empires, the modern world between the Renaissance and the end of the 19th century had a disproportionate esteem for the achievements of Greek plastic art. It stood out alone in men's imaginations, as though it had leapt out of nothingness into being, as though all that went before it was clumsiness, and all that came after vulgarization and decay. It produced ecstasies in the cultivated that fills us now more with wonder than sympathy. We know now that while the literary and intellectual initiatives of Greece mark a distinct new phase in human experience, the plastic art of Greece is no more than a continuation of the civilizations that had gone before. The goldwork, the jewelry, the seals, and the statuettes, and the vases and so forth of Greek manufacture in the Great Period approach, but do not excel those of the preceding Aegean people, nor those of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. The architecture has a grace and perfection of its own. Its dominant feature is the colonnade, serene and noble with the stout Doric capital, are graceful with the Ionic, are florid with the Corinthian. The Corinthian column and its ramifications became in Roman times the universal weed of architecture. They mean the thing plant wise, not the slang. And still sprouts wherever the bank branch or the Hotel de Luxe is to be found. It is the Greek sculpture, however, that stands out as the distinctive excellence of the period. Formal at first, it reached between the days of Pisistratus and Pericles an unprecedented freedom and naturalness. In the time of Akhenaten, Egyptian sculpture made a sudden turn towards ease and realism, but nothing then achieved can compare to the freedoms of the Greek release. We are told that most of the Greek sculpture was tinted in colors, while the ancient Egyptians conveyed a lot more meaning and stuff with their art, so greater realism wasn't quite the point. That peculiar, austere white beauty, ennobled by the touch of death and completion, that now dominates our sensibilities when we are confronted by the best remains of Greek work, was no part of the artist's intention. The temples, too, in their ruin, have a moonlight magic and unearthly excellence that was surely wanting in their garish youth. Of Greek painting we know very little. Masterpieces are mentioned, but they have perished. We can only judge by what may be the degenerating continuation of the tradition in the days of Imperial Rome, and Pompeii and Herculaneum. The painting is gay, joyous, skillful, and interesting, and beyond comparison more natural and confident than any Egyptian or Babylonian work. The music of the time was subsidiary to the song and without harmony. Sir W.H. Hadot speaks of the ugliness of such specimens of Greek music as have been preserved and deciphered.